He broke up with me because I didn't know enough about science. That was his stated reason. 3 years together, and apparently the problem was that I couldn't use Latin names for animals in casual conversation. 20 years later, I was the guest lecturer in a university science department. He was in the audience. And between those two moments, the universe, with a little help from me, some wildlife officials, an EPA tip line, and a faculty advisor's wife, had been very, very busy. This is one of the longest, most layered, most satisfying revenge stories I have ever come across. It spans 20 years, involves federal wildlife authorities, an EPA grant, a university ethics investigation, and ends with a background check that turned up records a lawyer had paid good money to hide. Hit that like button, subscribe if you're new, and buckle up. In the 90s, I met Jake through mutual friends. We were young, we were in love, and by extraordinary coincidence, we had both been independently planning to move across the country, and ended up settling about 90 minutes apart. It felt like fate. We dated for nearly 3 years. Jake was a PhD student in animal sciences. He was brilliant in his field, worked with animals constantly, and had built a life around his research. I was working, not in academia, and I loved being around his world. I became friends with his roommates, with the other students in his program, and with Mary, the wife of his faculty advisor, who worked in university administration and became a genuine friend. For almost 3 years, things were good. 2 years in, we were lying in bed together when Jake told me, out of nowhere, that he was finding it harder to be attracted to me because he thought I'd been gaining weight. I had gained maybe 10 pounds in 2 years. I was wearing the same size clothes I'd always worn. I sat up and asked him, calmly, what his solution was. He said I should try to lose weight. I told him I wasn't going to do that. Asked what he was going to do about it. He said nothing, and I put my clothes back on, went to sleep, and drove home the next morning as usual. It was his problem, not mine, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. We kept dating. I didn't know yet why he'd said it. 3 months later, Jake called me to break up. His reason: I didn't know enough about science. He felt he couldn't talk to me about his work without using common names for animals instead of scientific ones, and this was incompatible with the relationship continuing. I told him that was nonsense and asked for the real reason. He insisted it was the real reason. A month later, he came to return some of my things, and I pushed harder. He finally admitted he had been seeing one of his undergraduate students, a 19-year-old he was teaching. He was 26 and her instructor. I told him to leave. My roommate offered more emphatic assistance with that process. He left. Then something clicked. I had met Meg a few times. At one point, she'd been at Jake's house for a barbecue, spilled something on her pants, and he'd asked if I could loan her something to change into. I couldn't. We were very different sizes. And standing in my apartment after he walked out, I realized what his weight comment had actually been. He was a coward who wanted me to break up with him so he wouldn't have to do it himself. He liked Meg exactly as she was. He just didn't have the spine to end things honestly. I emailed Jake's roommates to let them know we'd broken up and to thank them for their friendship. They wrote back and told me they had already known about Meg, and that they were the ones who had demanded Jake tell me, or they would. The "you don't know enough about science" breakup was the result of them forcing his hand. One of them, a genuinely lovely guy I'll call George, suggested I come up for a weekend. He'd help me collect the last of my things, we'd go out, and I could have the fun that Jake had never wanted to waste money on. I said yes. George let me into the house while Jake was out. I walked through it carefully, paying attention, because I'd been around Jake's animals for 3 years. I'd paid attention, and what I saw that afternoon was useful. Jake had an animal in his care that was listed as endangered. He was supposed to file annual paperwork with the state, including a small fee, to maintain legal possession. He'd refused to do it. He didn't want the government in his business. He also had an animal that was flat out illegal to possess in that state, under almost any circumstances. It was sitting in a tank next to a window, visible from outside. I took photos of everything: the breeding setup, the conditions, the animals. Then I put my camera away, went out with George, and had the best night I'd had in months. We came home around midnight. Jake and Meg were watching TV. I was in a short dress. George was practically carrying me, and we made absolutely sure our presence in the house registered clearly. George spent the rest of the night periodically parading past their door, and we were not quiet. When I left the next morning, Jake said something unpleasant about how I was behaving. I ate a donut slowly in my rumpled dress while George kissed me on the head, and I told Jake to enjoy my leftovers. It was juvenile, and I enjoyed every second of it. But it wasn't the revenge. The next day, I had my photos developed and called the State Fish and Wildlife Office. I reported the animals, the conditions, the 2 species he shouldn't legally have, and asked how to submit a formal complaint. They were interested, George and the other roommate, both of whom were fed up with Jake's entitled behavior, submitted separate complaints to the university about a teaching assistant who had been in a relationship with one of his students. They told the story at the bars they frequented, to everyone in the program they could reach. Word spread fast in a small graduate department. Then I called Mary. I told her what had happened, the real reason for the breakup, and that Jake had admitted in writing to the relationship with his student. I had his emails. I forwarded them to her. She said she would make sure it was investigated. She told her husband, Jake's direct faculty advisor, while I was still on the phone. A few weeks later, George called me, barely containing himself. State Fish and Wildlife officers had arrived at the house. They were there to investigate. Meg was present and confirmed to the officers that the animals belonged to her boyfriend Jake, helpfully keeping George and the other roommate completely clear. One animal was visible from outside. It appeared to a neighbor's report, with no connection to me. The officers knew to look in the back window for the more serious issue. George, being on the lease, let them in. His room and the other roommate's room were quickly cleared. Jake's room was searched under warrant. They were there for hours. When they left, they took all of the animals. The only things remaining were some guppies in a fish tank. Jake had just received an EPA federal research grant. I called the EPA and asked how one would report that a grant recipient was under investigation for illegally harboring endangered species. The grant was revoked. He was required to make restitution on the funds already spent, close to $30,000. He would never be eligible for another federal grant. The state charges resulted in a $15,000 fine and the loss of his entire breeding operation, which had been worth thousands. He avoided jail time because all the animals were healthy. The university revoked his scholarship and removed him from his teaching position for the relationship with his student. He somehow avoided expulsion, finished with a master's degree his father paid for, rather than the PhD he'd been working toward. And that was that. I had not lied about a single thing. I had reported genuine violations to the appropriate authorities and passed true information to people with legitimate reasons to know it. I stayed in contact with Jake's siblings. They were lovely people who I genuinely cared about, and our friendship existed independently of him. Years later, at a family event, when someone brought up my name, Jake apparently complained loudly that his siblings still kept in touch with me instead of embracing Meg. His sister laughed and said she didn't make a habit of being friends with people who helped blow up her brother's relationship. That was how Jake's parents found out, a decade later, how their relationship had actually started and ended. Jake and Meg got married and had children. She became an accountant. He went back to breeding animals. I got a master's degree. My specialty, which I swear developed organically and not by design, helping scientists and doctors communicate their work to people without specialized training. I help everyone from small-town clinics to pharmaceutical companies to museums to film and television producers understand and convey complex science. I travel to speak, I get to learn extraordinary things, and I work with some of the brightest people in the world. You know, us dummies who can't keep up academically. A few weeks ago, I was giving a guest lecture at a university. 250 undergraduate and graduate students. After the talk, I was mingling with the audience when I heard a voice say my name. It was Jake. My face didn't change. My instinct was perfect. I looked at him with complete, pleasant blankness and said I was sorry. Could he remind me how we knew each other? He looked stunned. He said his name. I said I couldn't quite place him, told him I'd love to figure it out, then gasped and said, "Oh, of course, how lovely to see you," and moved on before he could say much more. I was the guest lecturer. He was in the seats. I was happy to leave it there. At dinner with the faculty afterward, one of them mentioned that Jake had been there interviewing for a teaching position. I couldn't help it. I made a sound. When they asked what I knew, I told them he had left his previous program under disciplinary circumstances after being found in an inappropriate relationship with a student. I kept it factual and brief. They exchanged a look that told me they understood the implications. Last weekend, my friend Mary called. She'd heard from a former colleague. Someone doing a background check on Jake had requested his file. The file still contained the complaint letters from over 20 years ago, the record of his scholarship being revoked, the documentation of why he'd left the program without his PhD. And it contained a copy of his arrest record from the wildlife charges that had been reduced and fined, his record expunged through a lawyer his father had paid for, invisible on standard checks, not invisible in a university file. Mary thought I'd like to know. I don't think he got the job. 20 years. He lost his grant, his scholarship, his teaching position, his animals, and his PhD over a series of genuine violations that he had chosen to commit, and that I had chosen to report to the correct authorities. I never lied. I never fabricated. I never did anything that wasn't a straightforward account of things I had personally witnessed or documented. The best revenge, it turns out, is telling the truth to the people who need to hear it. He walked into my lecture. He saw what I had become in the years since he told me I couldn't keep up with him. And somewhere in a university office, a file he thought had been buried is making sure the pattern of his behavior stays on record for people who are in a position to protect their students from it. The universe comes through sometimes, especially if you give it a little nudge. One more thing worth saying. He tried to make me break up with him by telling me I wasn't attractive enough. He was a coward who couldn't end a relationship honestly. And for a moment in that bedroom, that comment could have lodged somewhere and done damage. It didn't, because it was his problem, not mine. If someone who is supposed to love you makes you feel insufficient for how you look, or how you think, or who you are, that's not information about you. That's information about them. Sometimes it's worth looking more closely at what they're trying to hide. I'm currently very content in my size 10 pants. If this story took you on a journey, smash that like button and drop a comment. What's the longest, most satisfying slow burn karma story you've ever witnessed or been part of? I want every layer of it. And if you want more stories of patience, truth, and the occasional perfectly timed guest lecture, subscribe. New story every week. See you in the next one.